She rolled her eyes, slammed the tray down a little harder than necessary, and snapped, "Sir, you're not in first class. Act like it." The man simply nodded, his face calm, his posture quiet. He didn't argue. He didn't complain. He just looked out the window, as if the clouds held better company than the cold stares around him. What the flight attendant didn't know, what not a single passenger on that plane realized, was that she had just humiliated one of the most powerful men in Africa. Not a celebrity, not a billionaire, but the president of an entire nation, traveling in silence, in humility, in plain clothes. This isn't just a story about power, it's a lesson in how easily we judge others by what they wear, where they sit, or how quietly they carry themselves. And in the next few minutes, you'll hear the full story of how Ibrahim Traore, president of Burkina Faso, was mistaken for a nobody, and how that moment changed everyone on that flight forever. You see, before we dive into what happened on that plane, you need to understand who Ibrahim Traore really is. He's not your typical president, not the kind who surrounds himself with expensive suits, designer watches, or private jets. In fact, if you passed him on the street, you'd likely mistake him for a university student or a school teacher. And maybe that's exactly how he likes it. Born in 1988 in a modest town in Burkina Faso, Traoré grew up far from the gleaming towers of politics or international diplomacy. He was raised among farmers and teachers, people who worked with their hands, lived with dignity, and didn't chase luxury. His values were shaped not in palaces, but in dusty classrooms and village fields. Even today, he speaks with the calm confidence of someone who understands the weight of silence and the power of listening before speaking. His story took a turn when he joined the military, not out of a hunger for power, but out of a desire to serve. He climbed the ranks, not through corruption or alliances, but through merit, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of justice. Those who served beside him say he was different. He didn't bark orders. He led from the front. He didn't chase medals. He chased peace. Then came a time of chaos in Burkina Faso. The nation was crumbling under insecurity, corruption, and foreign influence. Rural communities were living in fear. The government seemed distant and disinterested. Hope was fading. And then, from within the military, a new face rose. Not because he wanted to rule, but because he could no longer watch his people suffer. In 2022, at the age of just 34, Ibrahim Traoré led a popular uprising within the army. Not a bloody coup driven by ego, but a patriotic intervention demanded by the people. Within days, he became the interim president of Burkina Faso, the youngest leader on the African continent at the time. But what he did next surprised everyone. He refused to move into the presidential palace. He told his ministers to cut their luxuries. He redirected state funds toward education, healthcare, and rebuilding security in villages long forgotten by the state. In press conferences, he often wore a simple shirt, military fatigues, or a modest traditional outfit. No golden pins, no designer brands. He didn't demand that people call him Excellency. He wanted to be called Ibrahim. For many across Africa, especially the youth, he became a symbol, not of power but of integrity, a quiet warrior who stood against neocolonialism, who dared to reject foreign interference, and who spoke openly about Africa taking back its destiny. And yet, the very humility that made him so respected is what led to the shocking incident on that plane. Because when Ibrahim Traoré flies, he doesn't reserve a fleet of jets or shut down airports. He often flies commercial, quietly, discreetly, sometimes without any security detail. Not out of weakness, but out of principle. Because he believes that a leader should live as close as possible to the people they serve. And so, on that particular flight, when he boarded with nothing but a small bag, wearing casual clothes and politely nodded to the crew as he entered, no one knew who he was. There were no flashing cameras, no press coverage, no red carpet, just a man sitting in economy class, by the window, reading a book, watching the clouds. But while he blended into the background with quiet dignity, others on that flight seemed to think that appearance equals status. The flight attendant, whose job it was to serve with courtesy and neutrality, seemed to take one look at Ibrahim and decide, consciously or not, that he was beneath respect. Maybe it was the simplicity of his clothes. Maybe it was the lack of a business class ticket. Or maybe it was the quiet confidence that he carried, the kind that unsettles people who rely on surface-level status. She was polite to others, smiled at men in suits, laughed at the jokes of foreign tourists, but when she spoke to Ibrahim, her tone changed. It became sharp, dismissive, almost irritated. When he asked for water, she made him wait. When he politely reminded her about a dietary request, she waved him off. And then came the final blow, when she confronted him for being in the wrong seat, even though he clearly wasn't. "Sir, this isn't first class," she snapped. "Please don't make problems." There was silence. Other passengers turned their heads. Some looked confused. Others just shrugged, assuming he was some nobody trying to get special treatment. But Ibrahim said nothing. He stood, moved to another seat, and gave a small smile, more out of kindness than submission. And yet behind that calm exterior sat a man who had spoken before the African Union, who had walked into rooms with world leaders and demanded dignity for his people. A man who had been called Africa's rising lion and a revolutionary with honor. But on that flight, not a single person recognized him. Not the flight crew, not the VIP passengers sipping champagne, not even the captain. He could have pulled out a presidential ID. He could have demanded respect, but he didn't. Because for Ibrahim Traoré, leadership isn't about being recognized. It's about recognizing others. And in that moment, his silence was not weakness. It was power. The kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. The kind of power that comes from knowing who you are, even when the world doesn't. And what happened after that flight? Well, that's where the story takes a turn no one saw coming. Because the man they humiliated would soon be met on the tarmac by a military escort, cameras and officials saluting him as Mr. President. And in that moment, everything changed. While Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly in his seat, the flight attendant walked down the aisle again, passing him without a glance. Her demeanor changed when addressing others, smiling at the businessman a few rows ahead, laughing with a foreign couple in the premium section. But when her eyes landed on him, her posture stiffened, her tone flattened. To her, he was just another unremarkable passenger in economy class. Maybe a man who'd saved up for this one trip, maybe a low-level worker from somewhere remote. She didn't see the sharpness in his gaze or the quiet strength in how he carried himself. She didn't see the man who had stood before nations and demanded that Africa reclaim its independence. She just saw a man who, in her mind, didn't belong. Midway through the flight, things began to escalate. Ibrahim had requested a cup of tea, politely as always, but the attendant ignored him, pretending not to hear. The woman seated beside him, an elderly lady with kind eyes, noticed and whispered, "You asked already, didn't you?" He nodded, his smile never fading. 10 minutes later, the tea came, but cold and slammed onto the tray without a word. Still, he said thank you. Then when lunch service began, she moved quickly through the rows, offering meal options, making sure the passengers in premium economy got their preferred dishes. But when she got to Ibrahim's row, she was visibly annoyed. "Chicken or pasta?" she snapped. "I'll take the pasta, please," he said. A long pause. She stared at him. "We're out," she replied flatly. "But you just asked," he began gently. "You can have chicken or nothing?" The woman beside him looked shocked. Ibrahim simply nodded. "Chicken is fine." It was becoming clear to some nearby passengers that something was off. A few began to exchange glances. Why was she singling him out? A younger man in the row behind leaned forward and asked, "Is everything okay, sir?" Again, Ibrahim smiled. "Perfectly fine, thank you." But it wasn't. After the meal, as trays were being collected, the flight attendant returned. This time she noticed that Ibrahim's seat was slightly reclined, no more than anyone else's. She frowned. "Excuse me, sir, please put your seat up." He nodded and adjusted it immediately, but she lingered. "You're not in first class," she added, louder this time. "Let's be respectful of the passengers around you." The tone wasn't just firm, it was condescending, as if she were addressing a child. A few heads turned. Someone gasped softly. A man across the aisle, dressed in a clean blue suit, raised his eyebrows. "Is there a problem?" he asked the attendant. "No, sir, just keeping things in order," she said, flashing him a smile. then turned back to Ibrahim with a final glare. He said nothing. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flash any ID, didn't make a scene. He just sat back, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. But 2 rows behind, someone else recognized the face. It was a young Burkinabe student, maybe 20 or 21 years old. His eyes widened as he leaned forward, nudging his friend beside him. "C'est lui," he whispered. "C'est le président." His friend frowned. "Tu rigoles? I swear, look closely. That's Ibrahim Traoré. From the news. He's the president." They both sat in stunned silence, watching as the man who had taken control of an entire country was being treated like he didn't matter. The student hesitated, then stood up and approached the flight attendant near the back galley. "Excuse me," he said in French. "Do you know who that man is?" She rolled her eyes. "A passenger causing issues." "No," he said, firmer this time. "That's Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso." The attendant blinked, caught off guard for a moment, but then shook her head. "Nice story," she scoffed. "People say anything these days." She walked away before he could say more. The young student returned to his seat, disbelief written all over his face. By now, whispers were spreading. Someone had pulled out their phone discreetly, searching up photos. The image on the screen, the same strong jawline, the same quiet gaze, matched the man in seat 34A. But still, the crew acted none the wiser. As the plane began to descend, the captain made the usual announcements. Passengers started putting away devices, raising window shades, adjusting their seats. Ibrahim, still silent, reached down to help the elderly woman next to him retrieve her handbag. She looked at him kindly and said, "You're a patient man." Not many would have handled all that so calmly. He smiled. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. But outside the plane, on the tarmac, something unusual was happening. A group of uniformed men had arrived near the landing gate. Not airport police, not standard security, military. They weren't just standing around either. They were lining up, standing at attention, waiting. A sleek black car had also pulled up near the jet bridge, with tinted windows and a flag of Burkina Faso fluttering lightly from the front. Inside the plane, the cabin crew had no idea what was waiting outside. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, passengers began to gather their things, some standing in the aisle, others still murmuring about the strange tension surrounding seat 34A. And then, before the doors even opened, a quiet buzz came through the crew's radio. "Security detail confirmed for President Traoré. Ready to receive." The color drained from the flight attendant's face. "President who?" she whispered into the radio. "President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso." Her hands trembled slightly. Moments later, the door opened. A uniformed officer stepped on board, scanned the cabin, and locked eyes with Ibrahim. He stepped forward briskly, saluted, and said, "Mr. President, we're honored to welcome you." Gasps rippled through the front rows. Passengers turned, heads whipped toward the quiet man in the back. He stood slowly, calmly, gathered his bag, turned to the elderly woman beside him, and said softly, "Have a safe journey." As he stepped into the aisle, the flight attendant stood frozen. He paused beside her, looked her in the eye, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with a soft, knowing gaze. Then he said 6 words she would never forget. "Kindness doesn't check boarding class." And just like that, he walked off the plane. The silence he left behind was deafening. The moment his foot touched the ground, everything changed. Burkina Faso's red, green, and gold flag fluttered gently on the hood of the black diplomatic car, waiting just meters away. Surrounding it, a line of elite presidential guards stood still, each one in formal military attire, boots polished to a mirror shine, eyes locked ahead in perfect formation. Cameras flashed, phones came out. Reporters, diplomats, and protocol staff had been informed ahead of time. But the flight crew and passengers, they had no idea. Inside the aircraft, chaos began to spread like wildfire. Passengers stood up, straining to see what was happening outside the windows. Those who'd spent the entire flight thinking he was just another quiet traveler were now realizing they had shared the cabin with a head of state. Some gasped. Others stood frozen, mouths slightly open, faces a mixture of disbelief and guilt. And at the center of it all stood the flight attendant. Her posture had changed. The authority she'd carried so proudly throughout the flight had vanished. Her shoulders slumped slightly now, as the full weight of the moment settled on her. She watched through the open aircraft door as uniformed officers saluted Ibrahim Traoré one by one. She watched as a senior official approached, bowed slightly and offered him a folder, likely filled with the day's briefings. Then the whispers inside the plane turned into low murmurs. "It really is him. Did you see the salute? He's the president of Burkina Faso, and we treated him like—" No one finished that sentence. They didn't need to. The elderly woman who had sat beside him put a hand to her chest and shook her head slowly. "My God," she whispered, "he helped me with my bag, and I didn't even know." The young student from 2 rows back couldn't take his eyes off the scene outside. His pride was mixed with sorrow. He had witnessed his president, his hero, disrespected openly in front of dozens of people. And yet Traoré had responded with dignity, silence, and strength. As Ibrahim walked toward the car, a uniformed officer opened the door for him, then saluted again. He nodded politely and paused before getting in. Not in a rush, not with a show of power, but with calm grace. His eyes scanned the tarmac. And then, almost without warning, he turned and looked back at the aircraft. It was a small moment, but for those watching, it felt like the earth shifted. Did he see the flight attendant standing behind the door, wide-eyed, speechless? Did he see the businessmen who had ignored him? The influencers in first class who hadn't bothered to notice the man in economy? He didn't wave. He didn't scowl. He simply looked, and then stepped into the vehicle. The doors closed quietly, and just like that, the convoy began to move. Smooth, silent, controlled. Inside the plane, the silence was thicker than ever. The flight attendant backed into the galley, her hands trembling slightly. Her mind replayed every word she had said to him, every glance, every moment she had dismissed him without a second thought. Her training had warned her about treating all passengers with respect, but in practice she had judged him by his clothes, his seat, and his silence. Now that she knew the truth, she felt something deeper than embarrassment. She felt regret, and it wasn't just her. Other passengers were visibly shaken. Some pulled out their phones and started posting what had just happened. A few were even searching Ibrahim Traoré to confirm who he was, and what they found only deepened the sense of awe. Posts began to appear online within minutes. Just flew with Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, sat in economy, treated like a nobody, never said a word. Wow. One of the most powerful leaders in Africa was humiliated on my flight and didn't even flinch. I'm speechless. A lesson in humility and dignity. President Traoré, I'll never forget this. By the time the aircraft was being prepared for its next flight, word had already spread on social media. The story took on a life of its own. Within hours, images of the encounter were circulating across the continent. Photos of Traoré stepping off the plane, videos of the military waiting for him, tweets praising his composure and criticizing the crew's ignorance. And back in Burkina Faso, hearts swelled with pride. In a country where political corruption had often left citizens disillusioned, this single moment of their president flying in silence, enduring disrespect without anger, and walking off with honor was more powerful than 1,000 speeches. Local radio stations discussed it. Youth groups shared it. Even his critics had to admit, the man practiced what he preached. Ibrahim Traoré became not just a political figure, but a living symbol of humility and leadership. The phrase, "lead like Ibrahim," began trending among West African youth. Teachers used the story in classrooms. Journalists quoted it in editorials. Spiritual leaders turned it into a parable. And everywhere one question echoed. What kind of leader chooses to walk among the people, even when he has every right to stand above them? The answer, one who understands that true power doesn't come from titles, uniforms, or first-class seats. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and not needing anyone else's approval to validate it. And as for the flight attendant, in the days that followed, she reportedly filed a formal apology through the airline, requesting that it be passed along to the president's office. Whether he ever read it, no one knows. But if he did, we can only imagine his response. Not anger, not punishment, but a simple reminder. Kindness doesn't check boarding class, because that's who he is. A man whose strength isn't measured by the noise he makes, but by the silence he endures. Whose leadership isn't about commanding fear, but about commanding respect through example. And on that day, in the quiet cabin of a commercial airplane, Ibrahim Traoré taught an unforgettable lesson to an entire world watching. Never underestimate the quiet one in the corner seat, because sometimes he's the one leading a nation. Before we begin this final chapter, we want to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done if you were on that flight? Would you have recognized Ibrahim Traoré? Or would you have brushed him off like the others did? Drop your honest thoughts below. We read everyone. The flight may have landed, but its lesson was just beginning to take off. Thousands of feet above the ground, one man had quietly carried the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders, and no one had noticed. Not because he was hiding, but because the world is often blind to real strength when it doesn't come with noise, ego, or gold-plated privilege. But when the truth surfaced, that this quiet passenger in economy was none other than President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the illusion shattered. The airport ground staff knew, the security knew, the protocol team knew. But it was the ordinary people on board who had to face something deeper, their own assumptions. Why did no one give him a second glance during the flight? Why was it so easy to ignore him, to dismiss him, to treat him as invisible? And why did he never correct them? Because Ibrahim Traoré wasn't looking for validation. He already knew who he was. That was the real lesson. You see, we live in a world where people often confuse noise for leadership, where some believe status must be announced, flaunted, shouted from the rooftops, flashy watches, VIP lounges, private jets. They've become the modern symbols of success. But Ibrahim walked in silence, and in that silence, he taught the loudest lesson of all. This wasn't just about a flight. It was about character. It was about power that doesn't need to dominate, that doesn't crave attention, that doesn't need first-class treatment to be real. When the flight attendant saw him exit into a sea of salutes and flashing cameras, it wasn't just embarrassment she felt, it was awakening. A cold realization that behind that calm, quiet man she had dismissed stood a revolution in human form. A leader not born in marble halls but in the trenches of a nation's struggle. A president who still believes in being among his people, not above them. And for the rest of the world watching the story go viral, something began to shift. News outlets picked it up. Social media platforms exploded with clips, commentary, and reflections. But this time, it wasn't gossip. It was gratitude. People didn't just see a leader. They saw themselves in him, in his humility, his restraint, his strength without spectacle. Mothers told their sons, "Be like him. Let your actions speak louder than your words." Teachers used his story in classrooms to teach dignity, respect, and patience. Even critics of African leadership paused, because here was a president who traveled without ego, carried his own bags, sat with everyday citizens, and left quietly. How many leaders today would do the same? Let's be honest. The world isn't short on power. It's short on leaders like this. Leaders who don't weaponize their titles, who don't confuse fear with respect, who don't need applause to stay on course. Ibrahim Traoré reminded the world that the most powerful people are often the least interested in proving it. That real dignity can sit in an economy seat and still walk off the plane like royalty. That leadership is not about distance from the people, but closeness to their pain, their silence, their dignity. That day on the tarmac, Ibrahim didn't deliver a speech. He didn't scold the airline. He didn't demand compensation or revenge. He just looked back and got in the car. But in that single look, the world saw everything. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't a smirk. It was a calm gaze, like a parent watching a child learn a difficult truth, like a leader watching the world catch up to a standard he had always quietly lived by. The moment was over in seconds, but its impact rippled for weeks. Soon, other airlines began internal conversations about how their crews treat passengers. Influencers made reaction videos, reflecting on their own behavior. Young Africans especially began sharing quotes from Ibrahim's interviews, flooding the internet with messages about humble power and silent strength. Some even printed t-shirts. Respect doesn't wear a name tag. Lead like Ibrahim. Sit in economy. Rule with heart. But for Traoré, none of this was about image. He didn't do it for the cameras. There were none on board. He didn't perform. He simply existed authentically. And that authenticity became his most powerful message. Power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears plain shoes, carries its own luggage, and offers a hand to an elderly woman struggling with her seatbelt. Sometimes power walks right past you, and you never even notice, until it's too late. And so the next time you're quick to judge someone based on their clothes, their seat, their silence. Remember that flight. Remember that president. Remember Ibrahim Traoré, because the most powerful man in the room might just be the one you overlook. And now the story is yours to carry forward, not just to share, but to live. So walk humbly, lead with quiet strength, and never forget, the crown means nothing if the heart isn't royal. If this story moved you, inspired you, or even made you reflect, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We bring you real stories with real meaning, and this is just the beginning. Until next time, stay humble, stay sharp, and lead like Ibrahim.